we have so much technology at our fingertips now, and it's only going to get better and better. My question to myself always is, how do we embrace technology without losing our ideology?
This is Growth in Dentistry, a dental intelligence podcast, where we ask the question, what does growth in dentistry mean to you? I'm Steve Jensen, a data dental nerd, and your host.
Welcome, everyone. Super excited to have you join the podcast once again today. We are doing a deep dive episode today, which are always my favorite. And before we get started, a couple of quick notes. As always, for our new and our old listeners, if you haven't checked out Dental Intelligence for a while, I want to thank them for sponsoring this podcast. They every week are willing to give out, as a consistent listener opportunity, a $50 gift card just for going and getting a demo of the platform. It's worth the time and investment, I promise. There's some cool new features coming out, scorecards. You can go and customize dashboards and things you've never had access to before from a data perspective. And we're always tweaking things. So if it's been a little while, come and check it out. Another call out as well. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do subscribe to the podcast. It helps us get the exposure out there, helps other dentists find us and get the great content, as well as other team members in the business that might be interested in growth in dentistry. Now, without any further ado, I want to introduce you guys to Dr. Galen, and I'm going to mess up your last name. Is it Detrik?
Detrik. Yeah.
Detrik.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I don't.
It's probably not the way it should be pronounced. It's just how it is, you know?
Dr. Galen Detrik. And let me tell you guys now a couple of just like things that we want to knock off. So this is his 11th year out of dental school, went to University of Colorado, big fan, it sounds like. And now he's practicing in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So you can kind of like place him on the map. You know where he's located, where he's practicing. He's not in California. He's not in New York, in these big city places. Okay. So he's in, I think, a pretty relatable space. Now, here's what got him on the podcast today. One of the cool parts of my job is I get to see all the dental intelligence customers. And one of the goals of this podcast is to isolate who are the highest performing practices across the country that have a unique story to tell that we feel confident doctors can learn from. And Dr. Galen and his practice is absolutely that. Their patient retention is in the top 10% of performance. Their treatment presentation is in the top 10%. Like, they're doing really interesting dentistry. So I'm excited for him to share a little bit about what kind of stuff they're doing. And then normally, and this, I hope listeners will understand this because we'll dive into this later as well. But normally when I see doctors present more treatment, so if they're getting into doing more all-on-4s and lots of implants and lots of creative stuff in the business, normally I see treatment dollar case acceptance go down dramatically. Meaning they're kind of throwing a lot of stuff at the wall, and they do produce more than the average dentist, but dollars on the treatment acceptance goes down, and they're actually a top performer still in treatment dollar case acceptance. So I'm super interested to hear, like, how are you guys accomplishing that? How do you think through the patient experience, your treatment presentation workflow, that whole deal? And I'm sure there's technology and stuff involved that you guys use, but let's start. Welcome to the podcast. Hopefully that's good enough. Kudos. And let's talk about your business. So tell us, like, how did you get into dentistry? Let's start at the basics and let's move into some of the business stuff. So how'd you get into dentistry? What brought you to the profession? And then how did you end up at this practice in Santa Fe?
Yeah. It's an interesting story. I will start out and say that that was the best intro I've ever had. So
Hey,
that's recorded. I'm just going to go, copy and paste it. I
hey, feel
appreciate it,
free.
man. So I got into dentistry. It was definitely not my first pick, as it were. I actually was going to be an architect.
Okay.
So I went to school for architecture, and then kind of morphed into more of like, I guess more like a civil engineering perspective, more the engineering and physics side of things. And it wasn't long after doing that I was like, I kind of need a job, to like help
Yeah.
supplement some of the costs of college. And so I started working in a dental office, and it was just kind of, almost like moonlighting there. And I fell in love with the practicality of the profession, and as well as like the immediate gratification, because I was toying between the ideas of obviously like these great big plans in architecture, but what people realize pretty soon in that field, so you can design a lot of cool things, they may never come into fruition, like may never be built. And that was also kind of toying with medicine, and it's like largely a prescription pad nowadays. It doesn't have that same, you just don't get to see the work of your hands immediately. And so that's what I ended up starting to fall in love with, is so like I can make a difference right away and see that. And that immediate gratification was really cool to me. So that's how I got into it. That's how I got into the field. Applied both to medical school and dental school. Got into dental school. Did not get into medical school. So I'm that standard story. I'm a medical school dropout.
Nice. But you still have the doctor title, so we'll take you
I
anyway.
still do, man. Yeah, I don't have to tell us DDS. No hangover here. So yeah, that's how I got into it. Then practiced in some really interesting ways, actually. So I had an associateship first out of the gate.
Okay, so you went straight from Colorado out to Santa Fe.
Actually, I went to Socorro, New Mexico, which was the college town that I went to.
Okay,
So
cool.
it's like a small 8,000 person town, rural New Mexico. And there's a dentist there who is an AACB accredited guy. I think he's a fellow now, really, really talented doc. And I spent a year with him. And so I really got the blessing of having a pretty amazing mentor right out of the
Yeah.
gate. But it was a small town, and it wasn't where I wanted to be long term. And so through a number of different circumstances, that kind of fell apart, that associateship. And I was sort of out on my own for the next several years. And what ended up landing in is actually like a very bizarre form of dentistry, which is this hybrid Frankenstein version of working part-time at juvenile detention center, part-time on the reservations in public health, and then part-time like trying to just like construct my own thing. So it was kind of wild, I mean, I went from like this beautiful associateship with an awesome guy to like just trying to figure things out. And and it was definitely a different experience going to a juvenile detention center, cinder block walls. You have no lab, you have no crowns, there's nothing like that. Like everything's composite. That's all you're doing. So
Yeah.
that was my life for a number of years. And it's actually where I met Devin, who's my partner up in Santa Fe. He was working in public health as well. So we met there. 5 years ago, he started his own practice up in Santa Fe, and he started blowing it up, and it was great. And he was like, I need a little bit of help. I was doing a lot of full arch dentistry at that point in time. So he brought me in 1 day a week. 1 day turned into 2, turned into 3, and now we're partners and been growing it ever since.
And things are going really well. Let's can we kind of like size up the practice? So we've got 2 doctors. Tell us a little about the team so that listeners can kind of like position themselves. Like, how does this practice compare to maybe what I'm doing? So you've got 2 doctors in there. Are you both full time?
Yeah, so we're as full time as we ever want to be.
Okay, yeah. I love that. I love that response. Yeah, so tell us what that means for you.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely, I guess for the listeners, I would say I'm going to tell you, we work 3 days a week.
Yeah,
we're eyeing 2 days a week and bringing in another associate. So it sounds like we're lazy, and there's probably a portion of that's true. But it works. It works really, really well. And we both spent like almost a decade of working 5 to 6 days a week. There was definitely times relatively, in the recent times, like
5 years is not that long ago.
It's not that long ago, right?
No.
It's not anymore, So yeah, I was working 6 days a week as a dentist, and you're trying to make a name for yourself. And I always tell dentists, like, it's how you get good as reps. Like, you just have to do, it's like with anything. So it was about getting reps. It's about getting really good at what I wanted to do. And so, yeah, now at this point in time, we're doing 3 days a week each. We sort of, we split the schedule. So he's there. My partner's name is Devin. For those of you that follow Dental Town, he was actually on the cover of Dental Town, like in the earlier part of this year. So great guy. He works Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I work Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then we're off on Fridays.
Yeah,
so
that's great.
That's our schedule.
And then team size, you have front office assistants, hygienists.
Yeah, so team's an interesting thing. We have 13 team members total.
Okay.
So it's a pretty sizable group of people. Yeah, one of them works remote, and then 2 of them are hygienists. Then we have 4 front desks and the number of assistants. So it's a good sized team. One of the interesting things that is difficult, I think, for a lot of dentists to understand is when you work 3 days a week, your team can't really do that. That's not full time for them. So dentists can. So what most of them do is they got to get supplementary work. They got to get another associate in, whatever. What we do is we pay them for that 4th day. So they work 3 and they get paid for 4.
Interesting.
That's how we supplement them, so that we don't have to compromise our lifestyle.
I'm going to ask one more question, because this was really fascinating. Because I just looking, obviously I get to look at numbers all the time. It's a fun part of my job. And looking at your business, there was something that I didn't bring up in our pre-record conversation. So in terms of sizing, there's like kind of this common, statement that for every like full-time doc, and we're saying like 4 days a week, you
Yeah.
need 1,200 active hygiene patients. Now,
Mhm.
what's interesting in your guys' business is it hovers somewhere between like 1,600 and 1,800 active hygiene patients. And we've got two doctors working 3 days a week. So some of those numbers start to add up. But tell us a little bit about like
Yeah,
I don't know if you're comfortable talking about production levels, but that's also
yeah,
like
it's
really
fine.
helpful because what makes your guys' business so interesting to me is that you're reducing your working days, but production levels, admittedly, if you were to split both of you off, you're outproducing the average dentist in 3 days a week with a dramatically smaller hygiene base. So a lot of
Yeah,
times doctors are like,
yeah,
hey, like I need to have 1,600 patients to fuel my clinical efforts, to get to, those numbers that I want to see. And you have something really
right.
interesting going on. So I'm a little interested with how you guys manage, you aren't the typical practice where you have like a ton of hygiene patients that are flowing through your clinical chair. So
Right, yeah, no, it's not, it's definitely not a prophy palace, and
yeah,
that's no knock against that. That actually is a great way of doing business if that's your model. Our
yeah.
model was just always destined to be a little bit different,
Hmm.
and I think the way we structured it, Steve, and is that we decided to really prioritize what we wanted for our families and our lives
Hmm.
first, and then kind of reverse engineered and said, all right, if that's what we want, then what would we have to produce per hour to make that happen?
Hmm.
And this is where dental intel comes like super, super handy, right? Like you're charting out your year. We usually do this in November. We kind of say, all right, we want to take X number of days out next year. And I teach a lot and I lecture a lot. So I'm out of the office for those things. So you have to take that into account. So it's always just like, all right, this is what the goal is for the month to hit our
Hmm.
number and to make sure we cover overhead and have profit in the practice. Like that's what you have to hit. So break it down to the hourly. And from hourly, it does give you a better perception of then what kind of patients do you need to be attracting into the practice, like the
Hmm.
quality of them.
Yep.
And it does put a pretty good responsibility in your back. Like you have to be good. You have to be actually you have to be pretty excellent when you're talking to them. Um, but I think most people, you probably know this. I mean, when you spend more time with a patient, your ability to help them see the problems,
Yep.
own the problems, and then the one to solve those problems goes up. And so that was the decision really is we're going to have time for ourselves. We're also going to have way more time for our patients. So we don't need to have as many at bats, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So actually, let's maybe start going into some of this like patient experience stuff because
Yeah.
maybe a couple
Yeah.
questions I have there. So first, like, tell us how long are new patient visits? How long are hygiene visits? How long are consults? 'Cause I'm assuming you're doing some consults. So maybe speak to some of
Yeah.
the stuff you're doing there. That first visit for the patient or
Yeah.
return
First,
visit.
yeah, it's a great question. So our first visit is typically it's going to be a consult. And that consult is really like get to know us. So that's an
Mhm.
hour long. And in that hour, we have our dedicated kind of new patient concierge. Her name's Karina. She's amazing, and she takes all the records for us. So she's taking photos and X-rays and all the rest. And then they're really kind of just getting into like, what do you need? What do you want? Now we don't always take all those records. Just FYI, if the person's not looking for a new dental home, but they're curious about a style of dentistry, maybe they got one of our flyers and they're like, oh yeah, I want to do cosmetics or implants. We may not do that full battery of diagnostics.
Mm-hmm.
But the general gist is give enough time so that you can. And then we try to allocate a good 20, usually about 20, 25 minutes of time with the doctor to actually go in and have those conversations and really get to know them. Like you and I were talking in the pre-record conversation, like how do you get high case acceptance at higher dollar amounts? And honestly, it's going to sound like such a boring answer,
Mm-hmm.
but to me, it's just treating a person like a human being. Like it, we say it to our staff all the time. Like patient experience shouldn't be hard. It is just treat that human being in front of you like a human being. Take care of them. That's what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very normal. I guess what we look at is normal. Maybe some others might say is kind of extraordinary. I don't really think that it is. You know, I don't feel that special about it. That makes any sense.
Yeah, no,
But
that makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah. From there, they're then going to make a decision. You know, of what do they want for their healthcare, and so from there, we'll shift them over to: do you need a cleaning? Is that where we're getting started? Do you need a referral somewhere? Get that situated, or are we getting right into the nitty gritty of restorative work? And so, yeah, it's kind of like our triage almost as a work experience.
Yeah, and then while I'm here, just so that listeners can get this, because it's a question that's kind of been sitting in my mind that we haven't hit. What type of dentistry are you guys doing in the business? Is there anything that you refer out at this point? So on the spectrum
Yeah.
of like we're just doing like classic restorations to like super GP doing basically everything, where do you guys fall on that spectrum?
Yeah. So Devin, my partner, is he's excellent at just about everything. He's really, really talented clinician. Very fast, very efficient as well. He can do pretty much everything.
Mm-hmm.
But he's lately started to give way more endos, and we have a great referring specialist that way. He
Cool.
places implants, but he does the ones that are a little bit more, I think he's cautious in a good way. He's
Great.
not trying to try cowboy up. So he does a lot more of the full spectrum super GP.
Yeah.
My focus has always been on comprehensive dentistry. And I think that if there's anything that I brought to the practice when I first came, it was that, because it was an insurance-based practice to begin with.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's an interesting layer we haven't talked about too. Okay, cool.
Yeah, we can talk about that. So that's where it started. And now we're fee for service. But when I came to it, it was like I wanted to bring that full totality of healthcare to it. And so we talk about, I spend a lot of time with airway. I do a lot of time with full mouth reconstructions, cosmetics, quadrant dentistry. It's like, how do we take care of the whole of the problem, and not just patchwork?
Yeah,
So
great.
yeah, but you don't want me doing your root canals, and you don't want me placing your implants. I make things look pretty.
Yeah, that's
So,
great. No, and this is good.
yeah,
This is good. And then in terms of like production, by the way, and this is maybe I haven't maybe dove in as much into like the specific numbers provider by
yeah,
provider, but my perception is that you and your partner actually produce at like relatively similar levels. So you have
yeah,
different focuses. So I think for listeners just to note, like there are lots of ways you can approach dentistry and still do lots of good by your patients and get them outcomes that they're looking for. And find your niche that you enjoy, right? Like it doesn't always have to be like a copy and paste of someone you look up to. You can find your way to kind of engineer that.
yeah. I love that. I completely agree. From a comprehensive perspective, which Devin very much thinks the same way. We both are really on the same page in terms of
Mm-hmm.
how we do it. It's more of like what a person's willing and able to take on. And so we both think comprehensively, but when I see a patient, it's always just the question of like, what do you need? Like, it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be, you can be pretty unattached to it,
Mm-hmm.
but we just don't play the insurance game of, which really is a game. It's like people have been trained to think one tooth at a time. And so dentists have sadly compromised, I think, in their mindset to adopt that way of thinking. And so they let patients and insurance dictate treatment, which is not at all the way it should be.
Yep.
Say what they need and then help it be possible and let them take on what they want and be unattached to that outcome. So that's the way we've approached it. And it's worked, which is great.
Now I wanna layer in a couple of pieces of data for some context that like move
Yeah.
us maybe towards some of the case conversation, but where I'm gonna start with patient experience. You mentioned that you intentionally spend, an hour like a consult before they even move into other stuff,
Yeah.
and the importance of a patient getting to know you guys as well as you guys getting to know the patient and now how that will impact case acceptance. One thing that I'll note there, we did a big study around me. So a month ago, I did a big study on this was for a marketing agency that was curious to know, and I thought it was brilliant. Wanted to know what's the impact of high volume new patient growth. So let's say
Mm,
I've got like 1,000 active patients, and I grow my practice from 1,000 to 1,500. So if we
yeah.
grow by 50%, or we double, we grow from 1,000 to 2,000. What impact does that have? That growth of this influx of all new bodies, what impact does that have on cancellations and no-show rates? What impact does that
Mhm.
have on case acceptance? What impact does that have on doctors presenting? So like our diagnostic percentage and our
Right.
patient acceptance. So a lot of these numbers. And intuitively, so what's interesting to me is I always hear, which is important. Doctors are so obsessed with new patients; they want a ton of them. They're like, that's gonna like keep my
Yeah.
restorative chairs full, and
Right.
that's not
Right.
necessarily a bad thing. Like I agree that we always want to have like a healthy flow of new patients. But what's interesting is when you start to put too much volume on the new patient side of things, and it's
Mhm.
more about volume and less about, like you said, maybe the experience and actually connecting with those patients you're bringing in, it
Yeah.
starts to break things. So when I looked at cancellations and no-show rates with high volume new patient practices, like they're growing way more, their
Yeah.
cancellations and no-shows go way up. And then when I look at diagnostic habits, they stay basically the same, but then case acceptance rates go way down. So
Interesting.
what's obvious is that a new patient, their first time coming, they're the least likely to show, they're the least likely to say yes to treatment, as opposed to someone, when I started to look at patients who have been in the practice 2 or more visits, when they've had that, they are more likely to say yes to treatment than anyone else, which I think intuitively makes sense when you start thinking about it. But it's interesting to hear you kind of talk through some of your process
Hmm.
on building this relationship with a patient and how that's probably going to lead into this experience. So I'll share some retention things. So a couple
Yeah.
things about your guys' practice. So the average practice, we call it pre-appointment percentage. So the average practice for all of just their hygiene patients. So we take out like the limited exam patients from this
Hmm.
group that have only come in for that. So if I look at all the patients that have come in for a hygiene visit, the average practice has 54% of those patients pre-appointed, meaning scheduled to come back in the future. Top 10% practices, so like the best practices out there for patient retention, have 70% of their hygiene patients scheduled to come back. You guys are at 76%. So you're like flirting with probably that like top 5, top 1% of practices in terms of patient retention. And generally speaking,
That's
I
awesome.
put a lot of weight on that number to speak to the patient experience. If the patients
Yeah.
aren't having a great experience, then they're not likely to schedule to come back. They're more likely to make excuses and be like, you know what, like, yeah, like I don't know my schedule, I'll figure it out. But you guys are doing something, and there's, I'm sure, some business skill as well to, having
Hmm.
that number be a high performer. But tell us a little bit about the experience. Like, how are you guys getting such a
Yeah.
high retention rate? Because you do have high new patients. Like, I think on average, you probably would know better than I, but I think it's somewhere like 50 to 60-ish new patients a month. Does that sound right?
Correct.
Somewhere in that
Yep.
range?
Yep.
Okay. So
Yeah.
it's like
Absolutely.
a good healthy amount when you've got two, doctors coming in. So you're getting some new faces in, but you also
Yeah.
retain patients well. So talk a little about that, and then that'll lead us, I hope, into kind of some of this case conversation.
Yeah, so number one, I think the study that you did is super helpful, actually. It's really, really cool because, and this again, you know, uh, is to the credit of DI, you have to have, you have to be able to measure things.
Yeah.
I think people look at technology and AI and data as like kind of like this trending thing, but really it's always been there. We just have better ways of actually like conglomerating that data.
Yeah.
And so what it does is it allows you to focus on the things that maybe are leaks that sprung up because of growth
Yeah.
so that you keep the main thing. And we went through these cycles. We've had those where it's like, oh wow, we only had 25 new patients, but we're able to track that. And so now we look at it and say, well, what happened? What did we start doing differently? Or we will, start presenting in a way where it's like, maybe that wasn't as effective. So measuring stuff, I'll just say as a backdrop to this answer is super helpful.
Mhm.
What it's always come back to is what you're saying is the patient experience, but how do you define that? How do you make it really good? The patient experience to retain them, the patient experience to attract more, right?
Mhm.
That people are reading about, and the patient experience of saying yes to what you've proposed is all the same thing. It's all communication,
Yeah.
right? All it takes is one person on your team dropping the ball on the communication side of things, and the person's like, ah, bad experience, and not coming back,
Hmm.
or you saying something in a way where maybe you didn't intend it, but that patient feels pressure to make a decision and they're like, yeah, I didn't like that. And it could have been a bad day for them, but you
Hmm.
didn't feel into that bad day. You didn't feel that they had just come from something that was stressful. And so you layered on top of that and you were
Yeah.
part of the problem, get grouped up. So to me, it's always communication. That's everything. You would be great, Stephen. Like you'd be awesome because you have that energy and that vibe and you're an attentive listener. A lot of dentists are just like, I gotta get to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. And that's why it feels the way that it does.
Hmm.
So I would say that's really the crux of what we train our team and what Devin and I really prioritize in our practices talking, you
Which
know?
I'll just say that as well. I think that shows one of the consistent denominators I found with practices who have higher case acceptance rate is they actually spend more time with patients. And that is I think that's kind of a scary move for a lot of doctors to make, that a lot of them are
Mm,
really like efficiency minded. Like, how can I,
yeah,
in the sense that like, how can I like flow as many people through this system I've created, and that will
yeah,
help me like maximize, profits or care or whatever the output you're trying to measure or look for. And so I think it can be scary for some folks to say, hey, like I actually want to like slow things down.
Mhm.
And it's scary because they're not sure if it's actually going to create better outcomes, right? Where what's fascinating to
Totally.
me is like time after time after time, when I see doctors take the approach you guys are taking, slow things back, I actually see way better case outcomes consistently.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
which makes sense to everything you're saying. It's this communication feeling where if I'm sitting in that chair as a patient and it just feels like rushed, and like if I say yes or no, it doesn't really matter. Like there's going to be another person they're talking to in 5 minutes anyway, then
Right.
it's probably going to be a different experience. So of course case acceptance is going to be a little lower, and it is what it is. But I think that's worth calling out as well. That time you guys take with patients does, I think have an impact on the case experience.
I think we fear our it's interesting. I think we fear our failures a lot, but it's a really irrational fear when you
Hmm.
compare it to playing the what if in a positive direction, which to me is really nothing more than just a commitment, right? So when
Yeah.
you drop insurance like we did, that way, and you go out of network, there's a lot of fears that come up there. And I'm not saying the person needs to do that or should do that. There's plenty of models that work extremely well with insurance. But for our purposes of working 3 days a week and what we wanted for our lives and our families and for our team, our team loves that. They love working 3 days a
Hmm.
week, right? It wasn't going to work. And so it was a commitment to, well, we're going to have to cut this off and we're going to have to
Yep.
play a different game. To do that well, I think one of the things that became very apparent is that the people you already have, like, don't get the consumer mindset of more is more. To your point, it's like slow down to speed up. And the fear might have been that we're not going to make it work, but you have better access to these numbers probably than I do. I'm going off the top of the dome here, but when I first joined the practice, which was 2021, April 2021, Devin had just done about 1.4 the
Hmm.
previous year. And when you bring an associate on, I've been a part of an associateship. We've worked with lots of dentists in our own company with
Hmm.
associateships, and they're tough. It's hard.
Yeah.
Maybe you grow, maybe a little bit, but there's that you kind of reach that cap of like 10% excess, which is too
Yeah.
hard for one doc, and then another one comes in, and it's a hard year. There's a lot of
Hmm.
transition, and you definitely take multiple years to get to where you need to go. But we doubled the practice that very first 8 months and topped over three. And then this year, now 2.5 years later, almost three, we went over five.
Hmm.
That was not because we had this landslide of new patients.
Yeah.
That's just not what
It's not
happened.
where it came from. No.
Not where it came from,
Uh-uh.
and so I think that people have that idea that like you got to have tons of new patients, or your marketing game has to be just crazy bonkers
Hmm.
and all this. And sometimes it's as simple as just the people that you already have, the things you already possess and
Hmm.
have connection to. Just
Which,
deepen those
which I'll admit,
connections.
I fall into that bucket. I go speak around, the dental industry. Last year, I had 31 engagements, and I have a habit of doing a lot of these classics. Like I said, there's 1,200 active hygiene patients per doctor, and that's going to equate to the right number of like at
Right.
bats. And I
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'm just playing. It's the law of averages. When I'm presenting, I'm playing off the law of averages. But man, when I
Mm,
when I get a chance to talk to someone that's doing it creatively, I don't know if you've heard of the book, but you're sharing the same concepts. There's a book called Profits First, and it's this idea
yeah.
of
Yeah.
like backwards engineering your life. So it's like, hey, what do I need to make? And then, and what do I want to make? What do I want my life to look like? And then I'm gonna try to like engineer my life into that. When
Yeah.
people can get into that mindset, it's so healthy. So I
It
I
is.
think
I
that's
agree.
to your point. It's one of the coolest things about your business is you guys didn't see like a double or a tripling in your active patient count when you joined the business, but from a production standpoint it did. So talk us through like what do you think made the biggest difference there? How did you guys accomplish it? Like a few numbers I can just call out, like
Yeah.
you guys, your partner was already doing a great job. When I look at
He's awesome.
restorative, like the restorative and elective cosmetic work done for every exam that he was doing before you joined was above $1,000, which is like still like a top performer. And just in the last, 2.5, 3 years, that number has almost like 2.5x. So you guys
Right.
are doing like a lot
Right.
more work per exam. you brought in this like comprehensive, it sounds like you brought in this comprehensive dentistry, mindset, and he's probably up
Mhm.
leveled himself as well. So talk us through, some of the moves you feel like have made the biggest difference, that like advice you'd give other doctors, and then maybe clinically there might be some investment you need to make. But yeah, talk through that so that listeners can
Yeah.
like, okay, if I want to like learn some things from this guy today that I can start like dabbling with mentally or messing with in my business, like what advice would you give? How'd you guys do that?
I always break things down into three categories: your skill set, data set, mindset. Right.
Okay,
And
cool.
so
I like that.
would just tackle the middle one first. I think data set, truly, I mean, I know we're on the Dental Intelligence podcast. But I just do. I think you have to measure things,
Hmm.
and that's from all perspectives. I mean, you got to have an idea and a pulse on your P&L. You got to know what things are
Yep.
looking like. You got to know what things are costing you. Like, what is your overhead truly at? What's your true overhead? I even think it's important to know what your business is worth. You
Yep.
know, um, those are just important metrics to have. So that's perhaps a more tangible thing to kind of organize in your head, but that has to evolve and grow as you grow as a practitioner. Skill set, I think that's the thing that it's fun to learn new
Hmm.
things, right? It's exciting to go to a CE event. It's exciting to learn a new talent. I just always ask, like, are you using the ones you already have?
Yeah.
And I'll give you an anecdote or an example of this. When I first joined, of course, I came as a comprehensive type dentist. I was doing a lot of full mouth rehabilitations, full arch cases. Um, and the truth is, like, people didn't know me from Adam, like, I'm a brand new person, and Devin gave me that vote of confidence, but these people don't know me.
Hmm.
So you have to go back to the intangible soft skill sets. I think those truly are the most overlooked in all dentistry because they're not that fun to work on.
Hmm.
you know,
It's pretty
There's,
uncomfortable.
they're
Yeah.
uncomfortable. Yeah, you see parts of yourself, you're like, oh man, who knew? And
Yeah,
I've been
that's
through all
fascinating. Like
those.
if a doctor recorded themselves, like just get in front of a video camera and like
Yeah.
try to present treatment to yourself, like you'd probably cringe, watching yourself back. But
Totally. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And everyone's favorite subject is themselves. And I
yeah,
think we start to do that. We overeducate because it's kind of like this is what we know.
yeah,
Versus like, why are you here? And
yeah,
would you consider yourself to be more of a proactive person or a reactive person? Because I'll treat either way, but I want you to know what you're looking at, right? Or
cool.
or modulating your tone and the speed at which you speak to people, and being okay with awkward silences after you've asked a question and waiting for that person to process. Like, those are things that don't come naturally to us as human beings, and you have to work on those. And so I would just make sure that when people think skill sets, yes, there's the things, the talents of your hands, but you also have to be able, like, your hands get better the more you do, and the only way you get to do more is if people are saying yes.
For
So
sure.
you should really work on people saying yes. Like, that's
Hmm.
probably the most basic skill set to me. So yeah, that's that. And then the mindset piece, which is that final bit, is really, if I had to boil down to one word, Stephen, I'd say it's decision, right? Decision means to cut off. And so that's really what I think we have to start to adopt. Devin did that. When I first came on, it was, we're not going to try this thing. It's the two of us together. Marketing right away was taking photos of the two of us. It was
Yeah.
putting money behind this guy. It was this, that, and the other. And it was a conversation about partnership right away. To me, that's a decision. And
Hmm.
so we're burning the ships. This is where we're going. And that's really uncomfortable for a lot of people. Let me see if I get proof first. And if I get proof, then I'll keep going this way. Well,
Hmm.
you know this with data, there's a lag. And so a lot of times the seeds you planted here don't show up for 2 months. You were
Yep.
doing something different 2 months ago. And then if you don't think about it that way, you start to think what I did today is immediately what I get next. And you'll actually misinterpret data.
Hmm.
So, and make bad, poor choices. So I think you have to have those three in combination to make something work. And that's what we've done.
Yeah, that's super impressive. Now, I'm gonna ask, maybe when you present a smaller case versus a bigger case, do you
Yeah.
put more work into that conversation? Like in my mind, if I'm gonna go present, a couple of fillings, it's like, this feels kind of like bread and butter, and it doesn't feel like
Yeah.
there's like the opportunity cost, like I don't stand as much to lose, I don't think, as a producer. But then if it's like I've got like a big case in front of me, I could see myself getting in my head where it's like, crap, man, like if I can't get them to say yes to this thing and start it, then I will have lost out on all of this. So do
Yeah.
you do you feel like you present things differently depending on case size, or do you kind of have like a pretty like consistent, like, hey, I know these are like, this is the methodology I follow on how I
Yeah,
present, and I'm
yeah.
pretty consistent that way? Like, talk us through that.
That's such a brilliant question, man. That's so insightful. Okay, so I would tell you that one of the things that dentists struggle,
By the way,
myself with,
actually, before you give the answer, part of the
yeah,
reason why I'm asking that is because I've got this little growth report. I'll share it with you, but it shows
yeah,
like, hey, when these two doctors are presenting treatment between 0 and 1500 and 1500 to 25 and 25 to 5 and 5 to 10 and 10,000 plus, like what is their treatment dollar acceptance rate over the last year? And it's
yeah.
actually like surprisingly homogenous. Like it's not, normally it starts like really high, like the small stuff doctors are good. It's like, 50, 60%. You guys are like 80% there. And then it normally like falls off a cliff and drops down to
Mm,
like 5, 6% on the 10,000 plus. But you guys
yep,
only fall down to 51% or something. Like, let me actually look. It's 50,
yeah.
40, 46% on like the 10,000 plus cases, which is just crazy to have such a small margin of change there. So that's where that question's coming from, just so you know.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay,
it's a
okay.
pretty extraordinary thing to see. So,
So I think that it's more difficult to have a patient say yes to a $500 night guard than a $50,000 treatment plan,
hmm,
which sounds lunacy, like lunacy to
yeah,
people. But I'll explain why. It's because it's more difficult to have a person value a $500 thing and understand why it's necessary or required than it is to look at a mouth that's a bit of a train wreck and have that person, they already know it, right? They're
yeah, that's a good
aware of
point.
that problem, and
Hmm.
you're just bringing a solution and maybe deeper awareness to why that's happening. So a big part of our practice is pattern.
Mm,
We're looking at, because that's just my background in physics, and that Devin was kind of had an engineering mindset too. We think like engineers, we think like scientists. So here's the pattern of things we see. Those are facts. They're not feelings. So here's what we can do about that. If you see a big time problem, I think it's easier for a patient to own it from
hmm,
a responsibility perspective versus something like a guard, which is a bit more of a band-aid. That's just kind of the way that it feels to them. So it's elective, right?
hmm.
And we have that term in dentistry where it's like the
Yeah.
crown is not elective, but cosmetics, that's elective. The way we've done it is we've almost flipped on its head where it's like your mouth's a train wreck and you have wear and tear everywhere. That's not elective anymore
Yep.
unless you don't care about eating.
Hmm.
But a guard feels more elective to them. And
Yeah.
so, and I think that's the way we've sort of flipped it in our heads,
Hmm.
and our convictions behind what we say have also flip-flopped too. So people feel that. I mean, things are energetic that way.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I'm a big believer in like what you're thinking here and what you're feeling here when you talk about something. People have BS filters. Like they know if you believe what
I
you're
do.
saying or not, So I tell people all the
Yeah,
time, like,
true,
I try to give
true.
people reminders. Like, I'm not a dentist. I'm a business guy that happens to, have a strong enjoyment of dentistry in this business. But me personally have been impacted in such a big way. Like I had a peg lateral that was really small. So I would
Mm.
like smile crooked, like I do kind of like a this smile thing for years until I
Yeah.
finally had a dentist, and my wife, she's a hygienist, like talk me through two things. Like one, braces for me, this was like their conversation. They're like, most people think of braces as like a completely cosmetic thing. It's not. Like they're like, you have like your occlusion is poor. So look at all this wear it's creating, which
Yeah,
I
yeah,
did have
yeah.
some like jagged teeth on the bottom. They're like, look, we need to get it. So you've got a nice, strong, like consistent bite. And then once we've tackled that, then let's start messing with some of these cosmetic things that you don't love about your smile. And they helped me over the course of several years get to a point where like
Yeah.
now I love my smile and what a dramatic change it's had on my life. And like I just love this business, man. Like the more people, so what
Mhm.
I tell people, so here's
Yeah.
the belief, the mindset is, if as clinicians, hygienists and doctors can believe, and the whole team really believe, that investments in self are always worth it. Like help your patients
Hmm.
feel that from you, that like we could invest in all sorts of things in our life. We could invest in index funds, the stock market, a new iPhone, a trampoline, like
Yeah.
trips, like, but investments in self ultimately, in my opinion, are really the best investments. I'm a huge believer in that. And that I think impacts the way that I communicate about things. And I hope doctors, it communicates
Hmm.
differently as well. And then just believe that care is important regardless of its if it's expensive or not. Sometimes, I talk
Oh,
to
yeah.
hygienists or doctors and they're just worried. They're like, that's just so much money, and
What's
Even
funny
if it's
about
expensive, it's worth it, you know?
you bring up something that's
Like I
so
would pay
critical.
hundreds of thousands of dollars if like in retrospect, if I could look back
Yeah.
and say like, hey, like what would you pay to just like feel confident and shameless smiling? Like I would have paid, you can't pay for that, but like I would have paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know?
Once you know how it affects you, right?
Yes.
And so that is what conversation and that skill set has to be able to achieve. You
Yeah.
have to be able to give people confidence before they have the confidence to say yes, right? So
Yeah.
I'm a big, I was a big like, Latin student for a long time. So
Hmm.
confidence means with faith, con fide, right? And so
Yep.
that really is what like confidence is not proof. I think we think that. Like I have confidence because all these things have been proven true to me. Well, at some point, confidence had to come actually from within. It had to be
Yeah.
something that you were putting out there. As a dentist, that's what our job is.
Mm.
Largely, that's what I see my job is I'm actually just somebody who's here to help give you confidence. You get to borrow mine until you have enough on your own
Yeah.
to go do that thing. And to your point, head and heart, that's what they start to feel.
Hmm.
I love what you're saying though, because that if you don't connect to that reality, all the data, all the skill sets, all the everything, you kind of go in circles, at the behest of what your patients are willing to do. So when they're treatment planning, dentists don't have standards a lot of times, meaning when they come to a person, instead of it being because these amount of marginal ridges were compromised, we're going to do a bonded inlay versus a filling, right? They're not,
Hmm.
they don't have that bar for themselves. What instead happens is it's a feel. How's this patient coming to me today? What do I think you kind of have like a subconscious, like how much do they have? What do they make? Right? What's their
Hmm.
demeanor? Do I want to work on them? All these different things. How's your day going? How's their day going? And that's what influences the treatment plan. So a lot of times it's like, I should do all this, but I'm not really feeling something right here. So we're just going to do with the one thing. And the way Devin and I
Hmm.
do it is it's the same every time. You're going to get these are the things that are going wrong. Here's how we do it. And if the person's feeling stoked, great. We're going to give you that big treatment plan. And that's a quick little side note. One of the things that probably makes a big difference, Stephen, in our numbers, I would suspect, I don't know if this is true or not, but I would suspect, is that we present the financials.
Interesting.
It's
As the doctor.
as the doctor. It's
Yeah. Cool.
redundant with our team, but you'll always hear the number from me. And you're actually going to hear it really early on. I'll tell a person, it's like, if I train wreck, I'm like, look, this is an expensive thing. And I think there's a place where we can start that's not that big of an investment, right? Maybe we start with a programmer, we start there, get some data, figure out where your job really wants to go, what's happening, what's the cause.
Hmm.
But you better know what you're getting into so that you can decide to get off now if that's what you want. And that is $60,000. Okay. And now that usually they're going to be like, oh, I don't think I can do that. Like, that's fine. That's totally cool. I would still start with a deprogrammer because even if I adjust your bite, that's what we're going to do. You're always giving them a bare minimum and
Hmm.
top, but I'm the one controlling that conversation. Devin's controlling that conversation, and they can hear it from us. It's a lot harder
Hmm.
from somebody who's probably never spent that in their life coming into the room.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And I consistently hear that as well from these like higher performing case acceptance doctors that they're willing to have that conversation. It's interesting that that's another layer within your treatment planning process. Now we're coming up at the end
Yeah.
of the time. I could
Yeah.
probably do this episode for like 3 hours. This should have been like a longer forum for us. But let's finish with our
Yeah.
last question, and then I'm sure there are listeners that are like, man, I'd love to connect with you. So let's start with our last question. What does
Yeah.
growth in dentistry mean to you? We ask it to every person that joins. And then let's talk, how to get connected with you if listeners want to reach out
Yeah.
or if there's anything cool that you want to share with them. So,
So I think growth is it's so different for every single person, right? It's
yeah,
just it's your own journey. And the growth in dentistry is the amalgamation of all these different individuals and creatives and people kind of humming at some sort of level, and it will propel the careers of all in the field as a whole forward. That said, growth to me, the next big edge in dentistry is we have so much technology at our fingertips now, and it's only going to get better and better. My question to myself always is how do we embrace technology without losing our ideology?
cool.
And I think that's the growth edge. The growth edge is community, right? It's
Hmm.
having a community that can grow with the technological advancements, but also always comes back to the analog and
Mm.
knows how to still be human. And that's where the growth edge is. If people can do both, you're going to be something really special. If you go one way or the other, I think you're going to start to lose out.
100%. I agree with that. In fact, your comment about community, one of the things that makes me love dentistry, and I remind our team here at Dental Intelligence all the time, like we work with entrepreneurs who own a small business in their local community that's
Mhm.
programmed to have anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000, 5,000 sometime, members of the local community flowing
Yeah,
through this business a couple of times a year. And it's a chance to like beyond the dentistry, even infuse something into your community. Like, what are you giving to
totally.
them? Like twice a year, you get a chance to have an impact. And I think it's such a cool business where most small businesses in the local community, they don't get that kind of interaction. You get to spend an hour
No.
with that many people a couple times a year. And it's a really cool business from a community standpoint. So I love that.
Yeah.
I love that answer. That's awesome. Now tell us, if people want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Best way is
I
probably for a
would.
website.
If I was a dentist, old or young, I'd be like, I got to meet this guy. Like you've had a cool story working and doing, some more public stuff. It's
Yeah.
not like you were like rolling in it then, and then kind of
No.
coming into this partnership and really, exploding is really exciting. So I think a lot of people would want to, share in some of that growth and learn from some of the
Yeah.
stuff you've been doing. So best way to contact you.
Yeah, best way to contact us. I mean, I always love talking to dentists. So does Devin. So is my wife. She's a dentist as well. We always
Oh,
just,
cool.
we love our colleagues, and we try to do a lot for them. We want people to succeed in this field. So I'd say hop over to our website, thethrivedentistplural.com. And we got some free stuff there for you. It's not your standard, like here's a little PDF. Those are cool content, like things that'll definitely change your practice right away. And just get started that way and just see if it's something that piques your interest and helps you.
I love that. And we'll throw that in the show notes too. So the Thrive Dentists with an S on the end,
You
plural,
got it.
.com. Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll show that in the throw notes and definitely reach out and get connected. This has
Yeah,
been an awesome. Thank you for joining today.
that's my
Obviously
pleasure,
we'll be in
man.
touch. It's been an absolute blast. And thank you to everyone who joined. My name's Steve Jensen, the host of the Growth in Dentistry podcast. Keep growing.